I never imagined that a single construction crane could stop a multi-million-dollar project. But looking back now, that's exactly what happened. The funny part is, I didn't sue anybody, I didn't threaten anybody, and I never once raised my voice. All I did was insist that a company respect a property line that had existed longer than most of the people working on that job site. The rest happened all by itself. My name is Ethan Walker, and for almost 18 years I've lived in a small house at the end of a quiet, dead-end street outside Cedar Ridge, Ohio. It's not a fancy place. The siding could probably use a fresh coat of paint. The mailbox leans a little when the ground gets soft after rain, and the gravel driveway has a few stubborn potholes that somehow return every spring no matter how many times I fill them. But it's home. The kind of place where neighbors wave from pickup trucks, where kids ride bicycles until sunset, and where nothing much changes from one year to the next. Or at least that's how it used to be. The empty lot next door had sat untouched for years. When I first moved in, it was mostly weeds, wild grass, and a few scraggly trees that never seemed to grow straight. Then one summer a development company bought it. At first nobody thought much about it. People buy land all the time. But within a few weeks survey crews showed up, followed by engineers, then dump trucks, then excavators. One morning I stepped outside with my coffee and found bright orange stakes scattered across the field like somebody had planted plastic flowers overnight. A week later a sign appeared. Future home of Cedar Heights Apartments. 3 stories. 36 units. Modern living. I remember standing there reading it while my neighbor Frank walked his dog down the street. "Well," he said, shaking his head, "guess the quiet days are over." Turns out Frank was right. The construction started fast. Faster than anybody expected. Every morning before sunrise engines would start rumbling. Concrete trucks rolled through. Nail guns popped all day long. Generators hummed. Backup alarms beeped endlessly. It wasn't exactly peaceful, but honestly, I tried to be reasonable. People need places to live. Buildings get built. That's life. For the first month, I mostly ignored it. Then came the crane. I still remember the morning I saw it because I was running late for a doctor's appointment. I backed out of my garage, started down my driveway, and halfway to the road, I slammed on the brakes. A massive yellow crane sat directly across my entrance. Not near it. Not partially blocking it. Directly across it. The stabilizing outriggers were spread wide like giant metal spider legs. One extended across the edge of the road. Another sat squarely inside my driveway. I just stared at it for a second. At first I thought maybe it was moving. Maybe they were repositioning it. Maybe it would be gone in 5 minutes. Instead, above me, steel beams were swinging through the air as workers guided them toward the apartment structure. The crane wasn't moving anywhere. I sat in my truck and waited. 10 minutes. 20. 30. Eventually I shut off the engine and climbed out. The site was loud, dusty, and chaotic. Workers moved everywhere carrying tools and materials. I finally spotted the foreman, a guy named Rick Dalton, standing near a stack of steel framing components holding a clipboard. I walked over. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice friendly. "That crane's blocking my driveway." Rick glanced over his shoulder. "Oh yeah, that was it. Just, oh yeah." I waited for the rest. Nothing came. "So are they moving it?" He looked back at his paperwork. Eventually, I laughed because I honestly thought he was joking. He wasn't. I pointed toward my house. "I need to leave." Rick shrugged. "The street's narrow. We've got limited space." I said, "That's my driveway." Another shrug. "Best place for the crane." I remember standing there feeling something shift inside me. Not anger exactly. Not yet. More like disbelief. Because normal people apologize. Normal people say, "Sorry about that." Normal people at least pretend to care. Instead, I got treated like my property was just another piece of their job site. I went back home and waited another hour before the crane finally moved. The next morning it came back. Same spot. Same outriggers. Same problem. The morning after that, same thing again. By the 4th day, I started noticing a pattern. Every morning around 7:30, the crane rolled in. Every morning it spread those metal legs. Every morning my driveway became part of their construction project. And every morning I found myself a little more irritated than the day before. Not because of the inconvenience. Because of the attitude. The feeling that somebody had looked at property they didn't own and decided it belonged to them anyway. I didn't know it yet, but that 4th morning would end up changing everything. Because later that afternoon I walked into my garage, opened an old filing cabinet, pulled out a property survey I hadn't looked at in years, and started following the boundary lines with my finger. Ethan Walker, and started following the boundary lines with my finger. Now, I'll be honest, I wasn't expecting some dramatic discovery. I figured maybe there was a shared easement I'd forgotten about. Maybe some technical detail buried in the paperwork that would explain why they seemed so confident using my driveway like an extension of their job site. But the more I looked, the more obvious it became. The gravel driveway sat entirely inside my property line. Every inch of it. There was no shared access agreement. No utility easement. No right-of-way. Nothing. The survey couldn't have been clearer if somebody had highlighted it in neon paint. I sat there for a while staring at the document, then looking out through the garage window toward the construction site. The thing that bothered me wasn't even the crane anymore. It was the realization that nobody had ever asked. Not once. Not the developer. Not the foreman. Not the project manager. They had simply decided my property was available because it made their lives easier. That's a funny thing about people. Sometimes the actual inconvenience isn't what gets under your skin. It's the assumption behind it. It's somebody silently deciding their problem matters more than yours. The next morning I got up earlier than usual. Instead of waiting for the crane to arrive, I sat on my front porch with a cup of coffee. Sure enough, around 7:30, I heard the familiar diesel engine. The crane rolled into position. The outriggers extended. One leg landed exactly where it had every day before, right inside my driveway. This time I pulled out my phone. I took pictures, then video, then wider shots showing the property line, then close-ups showing where the stabilizer foot rested on my gravel. The operator never even looked in my direction. By lunchtime, I had over 50 photos. The following day, I did it again. And the day after that. By the end of the week, I had enough documentation to fill a folder. Every image timestamped. Every violation recorded. Every morning following the same pattern. My neighbor Frank started noticing what I was doing. One evening, he wandered over while I was checking footage on my phone. "You building a case?" he asked. I smiled. "Not yet." He laughed. That's exactly what somebody building a case would say. The truth was, I still hoped common sense would solve the problem. A few days later, I tried speaking to Rick again. This time, he wasn't holding a clipboard. He was standing near a concrete pump truck yelling instructions to workers. When he saw me approaching, I could already tell he wasn't thrilled. "Morning," I said. "Need something?" he asked. "Yeah, I need my driveway back." He sighed dramatically and rubbed his forehead. "We're almost done with this phase. You've been saying that for 2 weeks. Construction takes time. On your property, sure." His expression changed slightly. Not angry. Annoyed. Like I was becoming an inconvenience. "Look," he said, lowering his voice. "We're trying to finish a building here." I pointed toward my driveway. "And I'm trying to use my property." For a second, neither of us said anything. Then he gave me a tight smile. "We'll do what we can." That's the kind of answer people give when they have no intention of changing anything. The crane showed up again the next morning. That's when I stopped trying to negotiate. The following Monday, I drove downtown to the city permit office. The building itself wasn't much to look at. Beige walls. Fluorescent lighting. A waiting room that smelled faintly like old paper and coffee. I walked to the counter and explained that I wanted to review permit records for the apartment project next to my property. The woman behind the desk disappeared for a while and returned with a thick file. I spent nearly 2 hours going through it. Most of it was technical material I barely understood. Engineering diagrams, drainage plans, inspection reports, site maps. But eventually I found something interesting. Very interesting. A section labeled equipment staging and site operations. At first I almost skipped it. Then one sentence caught my eye. Heavy equipment must remain within approved construction boundaries unless specifically authorized by permit amendment. I read it again, then again. A few pages later, I found another section discussing emergency access requirements. Construction activity could not obstruct private access routes in a way that interfered with emergency vehicle entry or exit. Suddenly, everything clicked. The issue wasn't simply trespassing. It wasn't even about convenience anymore. Their crane placement violated conditions attached directly to their permit. I remember sitting back in that uncomfortable plastic chair and thinking, well, that's going to be expensive. The woman at the permit counter noticed me smiling. "Find what you were looking for?" she asked. I think I did. On the drive home, I felt strangely calm. Not excited. Not angry. Calm. Because for the first time since this whole thing started, I wasn't arguing opinions anymore. I was looking at rules. Rules written by the city itself. The next morning, I filed a formal complaint. I submitted photos, videos, dates, times, copies of the survey, everything. Then I waited. And honestly, I didn't expect much. Most people assume government offices move slowly. Usually they're right. That's why I was surprised when 2 inspectors showed up less than 48 hours later. I happened to be outside trimming a hedge when a white city truck pulled up. 2 inspectors stepped out carrying measuring wheels, clipboards, and cameras. One of them introduced himself as Martin Reyes. The other was a woman named Denise Harper. They asked a few questions, then headed directly toward the crane, which had once again parked exactly where it always parked. I followed from a distance. Neither inspector seemed interested in arguments. They weren't there to debate. They were there to measure. Martin rolled a measuring wheel across the gravel while Denise compared notes against a site map. They photographed the outriggers from multiple angles, measured distances, checked property boundaries. Then Martin stopped beside one stabilizer leg and looked over at Denise. Even from where I stood, I could tell something wasn't good. She walked over. They spoke quietly. Then they measured again. A few minutes later, they approached Rick. I couldn't hear everything being said, but I heard enough. Approved construction boundary. Permit conditions. Private access obstruction. Rick's face slowly lost color. 10 minutes later, the crane operator received instructions over the radio. The steel beam hanging from the hook was lowered immediately. Workers stopped moving materials. The crane folded its outriggers. One by one, the giant metal legs lifted off my driveway. I won't lie. Watching that happen felt good. Not because I wanted anyone to lose money. Not because I enjoyed causing trouble. But because for weeks I'd been treated like I didn't matter. Like my property rights were optional. And now, suddenly, somebody important had reminded them they weren't. The crane drove away. The site became unusually quiet. Workers gathered in small groups, talking among themselves. Nobody looked happy. That evening, just before sunset, I walked outside to bring in my trash cans and noticed something bright orange attached to the chain-link fence surrounding the construction site. Even from a distance, I knew it wasn't good news for the developer. I walked closer. There, in large black letters, was a notice that made my stomach drop and my heart race at exactly the same time. Temporary stop work order. All non-essential construction activity suspended pending corrective action. And standing beside that orange notice, staring at it like a man watching his weekend plans catch fire, was Rick Dalton himself. And the look on his face told me the real conversation was finally about to begin. Rick Dalton himself. And the look on his face told me the real conversation was finally about to begin. The next morning there was a knock on my front door before I had even finished my first cup of coffee. I already knew who it was. Through the window, I could see Rick standing on the porch, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, shoulders a little lower than usual. Funny how authority changes shape when paperwork enters the room. A few weeks earlier, he had spoken to me like I was an obstacle. Now he looked like a guy trying to negotiate with one. I opened the door. For a second, neither of us said anything. Then he cleared his throat. Mind if we talk? I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. He glanced toward the construction site, where almost nothing was moving. The silence felt strange after months of constant noise. Look, he said, this thing got bigger than anybody expected. I almost laughed. Bigger than anybody expected? They parked a crane on somebody else's property every day for nearly 3 weeks. What exactly had they expected to happen? But I let him keep talking. The projects losing money every day were shut down. I imagine it is, I said. He nodded. We need to get moving again. Then came the part that surprised me. For the first time since we'd met, he actually apologized. Not a perfect apology. Not one of those heartfelt movie speeches where people suddenly become saints. More like the apology of a man who finally realized the rules applied to him too. We should have handled it differently. I looked toward my driveway. Yeah, you should have. He shifted his weight. So what do you want? That question hung in the air for a moment. Maybe he expected a demand. Maybe he expected money. Maybe he thought I wanted revenge. The truth was simpler than that. I want you to keep your equipment off my property. He blinked. That's it. That was always it. For a few seconds, he just stood there. Then he slowly nodded. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. No dramatic settlement. No lawyers. No shouting. Just a boundary line finally being respected. 3 days later, the city approved a revised staging plan. The crane returned, but this time everything stayed inside the approved construction zone. It wasn't easy for them. Anybody could see that. The lifting angles were tighter. Deliveries took longer. Workers had less room to maneuver. Every operation suddenly required more planning. In other words, they had to build the project using only the property they actually owned. Imagine that. Over the following months, I watched the apartment building slowly rise floor by floor. The project eventually moved forward again, but not at the pace originally planned. Rumors started floating around town. Some people said the delays cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Others claimed investors got involved. Frank insisted he heard somebody mention penalty clauses in construction contracts. I never knew which stories were true, and honestly, I didn't care enough to find out. What mattered was that every morning I could pull out of my garage without finding a 70-ton machine sitting in my driveway. Life gradually returned to normal. The noise faded as construction wrapped up. Landscaping crews replaced heavy equipment. New tenants eventually moved into the building. The chaos that had dominated the neighborhood for nearly a year slowly disappeared. Then one afternoon, months after the whole dispute was over, I noticed something that made me stop and smile. Mounted directly on the construction fence near the entrance was a permanent sign. White background, black lettering. Simple and impossible to misunderstand. Construction vehicles must remain inside property line. I stood there staring at it for a minute. Frank happened to be walking his dog again, just like he had been the day we first saw the development sign. He noticed me looking at the new sign. "Well," he said, grinning, "looks like somebody learned a lesson." I laughed. Looks that way. The funny thing is, people hear this story and assume it's about winning. They imagine some grand battle between a homeowner and a developer. But that's never how I saw it. To me, it was about something smaller and maybe more important. Respect. The simple idea that owning property means something. That convenience doesn't create permission. That a person doesn't lose their rights just because somebody else's project is bigger, more expensive, or backed by a company with deeper pockets. Because once you start ignoring small boundaries, eventually you stop seeing boundaries at all. And that's usually when expensive mistakes happen. Even now, every once in a while, somebody in town will bring up the apartment project and ask if I regret filing the complaint. My answer is always the same. If they had asked first, I probably would have tried to help. If they had treated me like a neighbor instead of an inconvenience, things might have gone very differently. But they didn't. They made a choice. Then they made the same choice over and over again until the city stepped in. So here's the question I want to leave with you. Was I right to report them, knowing it delayed the project and cost them money? Or should I have let it go because they were creating housing and jobs for the community? Where do you draw the line between being a good neighbor and protecting your rights? Let me know what you think in the comments. I'd genuinely love to hear both sides of the argument. And if you enjoy stories about property disputes, legal battles, neighborhood conflicts, and ordinary people standing their ground when nobody expects them to, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who'd have an opinion on this one. Because trust me, every neighborhood has a story like this, and sometimes the smallest property line can create the biggest consequences.